Hi, everybody. Glad you're able to spend some time in your life groups tonight. Last Sunday, we saw Jesus having two key interviews with two different people that when you take these stories and you put them together, they really show the breadth of exactly what Jesus' life and ministry came to do and what it does for us. The first interview we saw Jesus having was with a man named Nicodemus. Now, Nicodemus is a powerful, respected, religious leader in the community. He's interested in Jesus, not so much that he will be publicly seen just yet with Jesus. He comes at night and he says, Jesus, we know that you've come from God because of all the signs that you've been doing. But Nicodemus is not quite sure who Jesus is. And Jesus gets right to the point. He says this in chapter 3, verse 3, John's Gospel. He says, Nicodemus, I tell you the truth, no one can see the kingdom of God unless they're born again. And we talked about how Jesus was not just talking about a subsequent birth, a second kind of birth. He is saying that, but he's keying in on the type of birth. It's a spiritual birth. And Nicodemus, as the story goes on, you can see him processing this. And then by the end of John's Gospel, it's an amazing thing. You see Nicodemus not only being willing to be identified publicly with Jesus, but you see him believing in Jesus and serving Jesus. It's a fascinating story that really tells us that everyone, no matter of your position or status, everyone needs the life-giving, saving work of Jesus in their lives. And then we saw a second interview with a completely different type of person. It's a woman. It's a Samaritan woman. And Jesus comes to a well in the middle of the day when this woman is drawing water, and Jesus engages her. And all kinds of cultural alarms go off when you start reading the story, when you know what's going on behind the story. You've got the religious conflict between the Jews and the Samaritans. You've got really just a barren spiritual landscape that created really this massive division between male and female, even within the community. And then you have the personal life story of this woman and how painful her past has been. And Jesus speaks with her. He offers her truth, but also grace at the same time. And by the end of the story, you see this woman going back to her own village where she has quite a stigma, being divorced 5 times. And she brings the message of Jesus back to the village. And they are amazed. They come out, they meet Jesus, and the whole village ends up believing in Jesus and following him. This story tells us that anyone has access to the spiritual rebirth that Jesus came to offer. So the two stories together, they effectively really encompass the whole social landscape that anyone can find themselves in. And it speaks to the grace and the breadth of the gospel. When we read these stories for ourselves, the idea, of course, is for us to see ourselves in the story. So process that a little bit. Where do you fall on the spectrum? If you had an interview with Jesus, how would he proceed in the dialogue? It'd be very personal with you, but it would be similar in that he will speak truth and he will speak grace. Perhaps in your groups tonight, you'd be willing to share just a little bit about your story and what impacts you the most about Jesus' words in these two key interviews. It's a fantastic word that God gives us, grace and truth. Enjoy your time. All right, everyone, as we move forward this week in the life of Jesus, we are going to get to hear some of Jesus' most famous sermon. It's called the Sermon on the Mount, and you find the sermon in Matthew's Gospel, chapters 5, 6, and 7. It's probably a quite lengthy sermon when Jesus gave it in the original time, way longer than my sermons, and Matthew puts it together for us, and it's really a fascinating sermon. It hits on so many topics. It's pretty convicting, and it's also very, very encouraging. What you want to realize as you're digging into the details of this is the spiritual landscape of the time when Jesus was speaking. The spiritual soil was so hard, and people had grown accustomed to doing religion without relationship with God. And so one thing you're going to notice in this sermon is how Jesus draws comparisons. You've heard it said this, but I tell you this. That's something to look for in the sermon. And of course, the sermon begins with what's called the Beatitudes, a series of things that Jesus say are blessed or that make us happy. Take note of what those things are, and then maybe draw some comparisons yourself to this kind of spiritual soil and climate that Jesus is describing versus what you observe in the church today, even in Oak Point, Milford, but more importantly, what you observe in your own life, in your own heart. Jesus is giving an invitation to authentic spirituality with Him. It's a high vision, it's a demanding vision, but one that brings happiness. Enjoy your study.